Man looked at the German Shepherd and his puppies. What happens next leaves everyone stunned. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. David stepped out of his old pickup truck, taking a deep breath. The fresh air of Redwood National Park filled his lungs, carrying the damp scent of earth and the faint aroma of pine resin drifting in the breeze. The setting sun cast long streaks of golden light through the towering trees, creating an intricate dance of light and shadow on the leaf-covered ground. He had once been a successful engineer with a stable life, but a recent loss had shattered everything. The sudden death of his wife, Emma, in a car accident had left David unmoored. The small apartment they had designed together now felt cold and empty. He had tried drowning himself in work, but the silence in his heart remained deafening. In the end, he had made a decision to leave the city behind and seek solace in this place, hoping to find himself again. David pitched his tent near a small stream, not far from the main trail. He unfolded a map, planning to venture deeper into the forest the next day, but something in the air made him hesitate. In the fading light, the massive redwoods loomed like ancient sentinels, their silent presence heavy with secrets. There was something about this place that made his heart slow, as if the forest itself was watching him. A fateful encounter. David didn't sleep well. In the dead of night, an unfamiliar sound jolted him awake. It was a deep, resonant noise, not the wind rustling through the trees or the snapping of twigs under the weight of a wandering animal. He grabbed his flashlight, stepping cautiously out of his tent. The night around him was thick with darkness, broken only by the faint glow of the moon filtering through the dense canopy. At first he thought it was just his imagination. But then, a movement in the shadows sent a jolt of adrenaline through his veins. Not far from him, half hidden beneath tangled roots and moss-covered earth, something enormous emerged. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't human. David's breath caught in his throat, his fingers tightening around the pocket knife in his jeans. As his flashlight beam swept over the scene, his grip went slack in sheer disbelief. A massive stone hand protruded from the forest floor. Its colossal fingers reached skyward, as if struggling to break free from the layers of soil and time. Strange carvings spiraled along the cracks in the rock, faintly glowing when the light touched them. His heartbeat thundered in his ears as he reached out to brush the cold surface of the stone. The moment his fingers made contact, a sensation surged through him, like an electric current racing down his spine. A secret buried beneath the earth at dawn. As sunlight streamed through the gaps in the trees, David returned to the site. Pulling out his engineer's notebook, he began sketching the shape of the hand, carefully tracing the ancient symbols etched along its knuckles. These weren't just decorative patterns. They felt like a forgotten language, something deliberately placed there. Determined to uncover more, he used a small shovel from his pack to clear away the damp earth. An hour later, he had revealed more of the wrist and forearm, still buried beneath centuries of forest growth. This meant the hand was only a part of something much, much larger. Perhaps an entire buried statue. As he worked, a gruff voice startled him from behind. "You shouldn't be messing with that." David turned sharply, his pulse hammering. A man stood at the edge of the clearing, clad in a worn leather jacket, his weathered face lined with experience and caution. "I'm Harold Pike," the man said, stepping closer. "Used to be a ranger here. I saw that hand 30 years ago. Then one day it disappeared." David frowned. "Disappeared? What do you mean?" Harold's gaze darkened. "I mean, it moved." The legend of the Guardian. Later that evening, David sat across from Harold by the fire, listening intently to the story the old man had carried for decades. "The Yurok and Tolowa tribes have old stories," Harold said, his voice low. "They speak of a guardian of the forest, a being that once protected the rivers and redwoods. They say it was struck down in a great battle, buried beneath the land. But its remnants are still alive, waiting to wake up." David glanced down at his sketches, then at the strange markings on the stone. They matched patterns he had seen in archaeological texts before, but now they were more than just designs. They were part of something ancient. Harold watched him closely. "You didn't just find an old statue, David. You touched something older than us, something that wasn't meant to be disturbed. A choice that could change everything." David woke up the next morning feeling different. For years, he had thought of himself as nothing more than an engineer, a man of logic, bound by science and reason. But here in Redwood, something was shifting inside him. Standing before the stone hand, he wrestled with a choice. If this was truly a remnant of an ancient guardian, should it be unearthed? Or should it remain undisturbed, a secret that belonged to the forest? The answer came when he placed his palm against the stone once more. A powerful gust of wind swept through the trees, and for a brief moment, he swore he could hear something whispering through the leaves. David stepped back, understanding. Some mysteries of nature weren't meant to be solved. They were meant to be honored. Before he left, he placed a small marker near the site, not to claim it, but as a reminder to himself. A sign that he had been here, that he had listened. A gentle breeze rustled through the towering redwoods, carrying away his breath like a quiet acknowledgement. And David knew. Redwood had answered him. A silent plea in the forest. David knelt slowly, keeping his movements measured and careful. Freya, the German shepherd, was watching him intently, her ears pricked, body tense as she shielded her 4 tiny pups beneath the exposed roots of a massive redwood. She was exhausted, her ribs pressed against her dull coat, and her eyes, though filled with caution, carried something deeper. A silent plea. David extended his hand, palm up, his voice gentle. "Hey there, girl." "It's okay," Freya growled low, a protective warning, but there was no real aggression in it. Just fear. Just the overwhelming instinct to protect her young. The pups, no more than a few weeks old, whimpered and shuffled against their mother's warmth. David understood that kind of fear. He had lived with it for months now. Ever since Emma's accident, he knew what it felt like to be lost, to be barely holding on. "I won't hurt them," he promised. "I just want to help." He reached into his backpack, pulling out a granola bar and breaking it into small pieces. It wasn't ideal, but it was something. He tossed a few crumbs toward Freya, watching as her nose twitched, debating between hunger and distrust. Then, with a reluctant movement, she crawled forward, sniffing at the offering before taking it carefully between her teeth. David let out a slow breath. That was enough for now. A shelter for the night. The sun was slipping lower, painting streaks of amber and crimson across the sky. David knew he couldn't leave them here. The cold would set in soon, and in her weakened state, Freya might not make it through another night. The pups squirmed, their tiny paws pressing against Freya's belly, searching for warmth and milk she could barely provide. David made his decision. "All right, girl. We need to get you somewhere safe." It took time, patience. He let Freya eat a little more, let her adjust to his presence. Slowly, he pulled off his flannel shirt, bundling 2 of the puppies inside. The other 2, Freya carefully took in her mouth, her motherly instincts overriding her fear of him. With measured steps, David led them back toward his campsite. The whole way, Freya never let him out of her sight. The unexpected visitor that night, as the fire crackled softly outside his tent. David sat with Freya curled just a few feet away. The pups nestled against her, making soft, contented sounds as they slept. Freya was still alert, her gaze never leaving him entirely, but she no longer growled when he moved. Progress. David sat back, staring up at the sky, the stars filtering through the thick canopy above. The weight in his chest felt different. Not gone, but lighter somehow. Then, just as he was beginning to doze off, a sound. Not the gentle rustling of the trees, not the distant call of an owl, a low, guttural growl from Freya. David's senses snapped to attention. He followed her gaze toward the tree line, where the darkness thickened beyond the reach of his campfire's glow. Something was watching them. Shadows in the redwood. David moved carefully, his hand inching toward his flashlight. He clicked it on, sweeping the beam across the trees. For a moment, there was nothing. Just the forest, just the hush of the night. Then, movement. A figure standing just at the edge of the light. David's pulse pounded. At first he thought it was an animal, but as the shape shifted, stepped forward, he realized it was a man, an old man. Ragged clothes, a beard streaked with silver, eyes shadowed beneath the brim of a weathered hat. "You found her," the stranger said, voice rough, cracking with disuse. David's grip tightened on his flashlight. "Who are you?" The old man took another step forward, his gaze flickering to Freya, then back to David. "Harold Pike. Used to be a ranger here. That dog," he nodded toward Freya. "She's been running these woods for a long time. Been looking for her." David exchanged a glance with Freya, who remained tense, unmoving. "Why?" The old ranger let out a heavy breath. "Because she wasn't always alone." The tragedy of Freya. Harold sat by the fire, his hands stretched toward the warmth. David remained wary but listened as the old ranger spoke. "She had an owner once, A man named Joe Calloway lived in a cabin near the Smith River. A quiet guy, but kind. Good to that dog. Then, about 6 months ago, he disappeared. David frowned. Disappeared? Harold nodded. Went out one day and never came back. Search teams looked, but we never found a body. Just his cabin, doors open, firewood stacked like he meant to return. And Freya wandering the woods alone. David felt a chill creep down his spine. So, what do you think happened? Harold's gaze drifted toward the trees. Some folks say he fell into the river, got swept away. Others think he ran into something he shouldn't have. Like what? David asked. But he already had a feeling he knew the answer. The old ranger met his gaze. You saw it, didn't you? David didn't move, didn't speak. The hand. The stone buried beneath the earth. Harold exhaled, shaking his head. Joe was obsessed with that thing. Thought it meant something. Thought it was part of something bigger. He started searching deeper into the woods. And then, he was gone. David swallowed, glancing at Freya. And the puppies? Harold's face softened. She must have been pregnant when Joe vanished. Had them alone survived the best she could. A silence settled between them, heavy and unspoken. Freya had lost someone too. David reached out, gently scratching behind her ear. She didn't flinch this time. They understood each other now. The road ahead as the fire burned lower, Harold stood. I'll help you get her somewhere safe. There's a vet in Crescent City. Good people. They'll take care of them. David hesitated. A few hours ago, that would have made sense. But now? Now, he wasn't sure. His gaze drifted toward the forest, toward the shadows stretching beyond the fire's glow. The buried hand, the unanswered questions, the thing that had stolen Joe Calloway from these woods, and Freya, sitting beside him, watching him with eyes that held an unshakable trust. For the first time in months, David felt something stir inside him. A purpose. No, he said finally. Not yet. Harold raised an eyebrow. Not yet. David looked toward the trees. There's more to this. Freya's ears twitched. She let out a quiet huff, settling beside him. She wasn't leaving. And neither was he. The secrets beneath the moss. The morning air in Redwood National Park was crisp, laced with the scent of damp earth and pine. David stood at the edge of the clearing, staring down at the massive stone hand that jutted out from the moss-covered ground. The fingers were curled slightly, as if frozen mid-motion, and intricate, ancient-looking symbols spiraled along the knuckles. His breath came slower now. His heart beat steady but deep, as if the sight of this relic resonated with something primal inside him. Freya sat beside him, ears alert, but body relaxed, her trust in him now unquestionable. Her pups, nestled safely in the makeshift shelter David had built near his campsite, whined softly in their sleep. David knelt and ran his fingers across the cold stone surface. It was smooth yet weathered, as if it had been here for centuries, maybe longer. A shiver ran through him. Not of fear, but of anticipation. Harold Pike's words from the night before echoed in his mind. Joe Calloway was looking for something. And then he vanished. Was this what he had been searching for? What are you? David murmured, tracing the strange engravings with his fingertips. The stone beneath his touch felt warm. Not like the sun had heated it. Not like ordinary rock. A pulse, almost imperceptible, seemed to thrum just beneath the surface. David jerked his hand back, inhaling sharply. Freya let out a low whine, nudging his knee. It wasn't his imagination. This thing was alive. The missing pieces. David had never believed in legends, in myths woven into the fabric of forgotten places. He was an engineer. A man who understood logic, structure, the hard truths of physics. But as he stared at the half-buried stone hand, something deep in his gut whispered that this was more than just a relic. It was a part of something bigger. Freya paced beside him, restless. Her tail flicked as she sniffed at the earth around the base of the statue fragment. David followed her lead, running his hands along the edges of the stone until he felt something shift beneath the moss. A gap, a seam in the earth. David swallowed. Was there more buried beneath? He grabbed a fallen branch and used it to pry at the ground, displacing a thick layer of soil and damp leaves. The earth crumbled away, revealing what looked like the curve of a wrist, leading further underground. David's pulse quickened. This wasn't just a hand, it was an arm. possibly a whole statue. A sudden intrusion. David barely had time to process the implications when Freya suddenly stiffened, her ears flattening. A rustle in the trees. A snap of a branch. Someone was watching. David turned sharply, scanning the thick forest. At first he saw nothing but towering redwoods and shifting shadows. Then, movement. A dark figure. Too tall. Too still. Then a voice, gravelly, hesitant. "You shouldn't be digging." David's stomach tightened. The figure stepped into the light. An old man, gaunt but sturdy, dressed in layers of worn-out flannel and an old ranger's cap. His sharp blue eyes were locked onto David with an unsettling intensity. David exhaled, recognizing him. Harold Pike. The retired ranger took a few cautious steps forward, gaze flicking between David, Freya, and the exposed stone. "Didn't think anyone else would ever find it," Harold muttered, kneeling beside the relic, running a weathered hand over the carvings like a man touching a long-lost memory. David swallowed. "You know what this is?" Harold let out a dry chuckle. "No one knows what this is." The unfinished story. They sat by David's campfire, the firelight flickering over Harold's face as he told the story. Back in the 90s, a couple of hikers found this thing. Just the fingers poking out of the ground back then. Park officials thought it was some lost sculpture, but no one could explain where it came from. Then, weird things started happening. David frowned. "Weird?" Harold nodded. "People started hearing things in the woods, seeing things, shadows moving where they shouldn't. One ranger, guy named Joe Calloway, got obsessed with this thing, swore it wasn't just a statue, said it was something, waiting." The hairs on David's arms stood on end. "Then one night," Harold continued, voice dropping lower, "Joe vanished. Just like that. No body, no tracks. His cabin was still warm when they found it, like he just stepped outside and disappeared." David's grip on his coffee cup tightened. "A warning." Ignored. The fire crackled between them as the old ranger leaned forward, voice hushed but urgent. "Listen to me, son. I know what it feels like to lose someone and look for answers in places you shouldn't, but you don't want to dig too deep here. Some things aren't meant to be found." David's jaw tightened. He knew Harold meant well, but something called to him from that stone hand, from the secrets buried beneath it. Maybe it was just his engineering mind craving an explanation. Or maybe, just maybe, he was meant to find it. He glanced at Freya, who sat close, unblinking, as if she too understood that something bigger was at play. David stood, brushing dirt from his jeans. "I have to know what's down there." Harold exhaled, shaking his head. "Then God help you." The first clue. Later that night, unable to sleep, David grabbed a notebook and flashlight and returned to the clearing alone. He traced the symbols again, sketching them carefully. They weren't random. They had patterns, a language of sort. But the more he studied them, the more he noticed something odd. One set of engravings looked newer, fresher, like someone had carved them after the rest of the statue had already been buried. David's breath caught. Joe Calloway had been carving something. A single word stood out among the ancient symbols, etched in a human hand. One word, one warning. "Don't." What lies beneath? David's mind raced. If Joe had left this message, then it meant he had uncovered something, and it had terrified him enough to leave a warning behind. But David wasn't backing down. He had lost Emma. He had lost his sense of purpose. But this felt important. Freya whined softly beside him, nudging his leg. David exhaled, resting a hand on her head. "I know, girl. I feel it too." The forest around them was silent, but the weight of something unseen pressed against the air. Something was buried here, and David was going to find it. A new responsibility. The sun had barely risen when David loaded Freya and her puppies into the back of his truck. The weight of the previous night's discovery, the stone hand, the etched warning, Harold Pike's cryptic story, still sat heavy in his mind. But right now, his focus had to be on Freya and her litter. The mother dog lay curled protectively around her pups, ears flicking at every sound, but she was exhausted. The weight she had lost was clear in the sharp outline of her ribs, and her breathing was shallow. The pups, no more than a few weeks old, whimpered weakly as they clung to her warmth. David's fingers tightened on the steering wheel. He couldn't afford to let them down. The vet's assessment. The Redwood Animal Clinic was a modest building just outside Crescent City, with a faded wooden sign and a small gravel parking lot. David pulled in, cut the engine, and carefully lifted Freya into his arms. The puppies were wrapped in an old sweatshirt tucked securely against his chest. A bell jingled as he stepped inside. The scent of antiseptic mixed with the faint, familiar musk of animals. A kind-eyed vet technician, Laura, greeted him. "Looks like you've got your hands full." "Yeah," David exhaled. "I found them in the forest. The mother's weak, and the pups, I don't know if they've been getting enough milk." Laura nodded, guiding him to an exam room. Minutes later, Dr. Emily Parsons, a woman in her mid-40s with sharp but compassionate eyes, entered and immediately set to work. She ran careful hands over Freya, checking her gums, heartbeat, and reflexes, then moved on to the pups. After what felt like an eternity, she straightened, rubbing her hands on her coat. "They're lucky you found them," she said. "Freya's severely underweight and dehydrated. Her milk supply is running low. The pups are weak, but with the right care, they'll be okay." David let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "So what do I do?" Dr. Parsons smiled. "Bottle feed the puppies with formula every few hours until Freya's strength returns. Make sure she gets high-protein food, plenty of water, and a warm place to rest." She paused, studying him. "Are you planning to keep them?" David hesitated. Was he? The thought hadn't fully formed, but as he looked at Freya, her tired, trusting eyes watching him, he realized he already knew the answer. "Yeah," he said quietly, "I think I am." Building trust back at his rented cabin near the edge of the forest, David set up a safe space for Freya and the pups. He cleared a corner in the small living room, laying down blankets and an old sleeping bag. Freya curled up immediately, her pups nestling into her belly. But as he reached out to pet her, she tensed. David froze, letting her decide. Then slowly, she lowered her head into his palm. The smallest pup, a tiny black and tan male with oversized paws, wriggled away from the others and clumsily stumbled toward David's lap. A small laugh escaped him as he carefully scooped the little one up. "You're braver than your mom, huh?" he murmured, rubbing the puppy's velvety ears. For the first time in months, since Emma's passing, David felt something shift inside him. Not healing, not yet, but maybe something close. A midnight warning. David woke suddenly in the dead of night, his body tensed before his mind caught up. The cabin was silent, save for the soft breaths of Freya and her pups, but something felt off. Then, a sound, a faint scraping from outside. David swung his legs out of bed and grabbed his flashlight. He cracked open the door just enough to scan the darkened forest beyond his porch. Nothing. But the moment he stepped outside, the air changed, thicker, charged with an almost palpable weight. The trees whispered in the wind, but beneath that, he heard it again. Scraping, digging. His chest tightened. The clearing. The stone hand. David hurried toward it, his flashlight beam cutting through the dense fog. The moment he reached the site, his breath caught in his throat. The ground had been disturbed. Dirt had been freshly moved, the moss torn away from the statue's wrist. Someone or something had been here. David's pulse hammered. The carvings along the stone surface seemed deeper, as if whatever was beneath had begun pushing upward. And then he saw it. A new marking, carved since the last time I'd been here. Another message. A single word. Soon. Unfinished business. David couldn't sleep after that. He sat on the floor near Freya and the pups, absently stroking the mother dog's fur as he stared at his notebook. The carvings, the missing statue pieces, the warning Joe Calloway had left behind, and now, this, the fresh message. Someone else knew. Or worse, someone else was watching. Freya stirred beside him, her body shifting closer, offering quiet reassurance. David let out a slow breath. He had a decision to make. He could walk away, ignore the past, bury his curiosity, and focus on the new responsibility he had taken on with Freya and the pups. Or, he could dig deeper, find the missing pieces, uncover the truth. Outside, the towering redwoods stood watch, their ancient limbs silhouetted against the silver moonlight. David reached for his pen and circled the word in his notebook. Soon, his gut told him one thing. It was already too late to turn back. Unraveling the mystery, the morning air was crisp as David made his way back into the Redwood National Park, his camera slung over his shoulder, a notebook in his pocket, and a nagging sense of urgency in his gut. The word, soon, still haunted him. Someone or something had been at the stone hand after him, and they had left a message. Whether it was a warning or an invitation, David wasn't sure, but he knew he couldn't ignore it. Examining the stone hand when he reached the clearing, Sunlight streamed through the towering redwoods, illuminating the massive stone hand protruding from the earth. It looked more surreal in the morning light, the intricate carvings along its knuckles catching the glow like veins of old silver. He knelt beside it, brushing away the dirt disturbed from the night before. The new carving was still there, deep, precise, almost deliberate. Soon, David exhaled, steadying himself. He pulled out his camera and began snapping high-resolution photographs from different angles, capturing the faint details of the etched symbols that wrapped around the stone's fingers. Then, with his notebook open, he began sketching. Something about the patterns, spirals, arches, sharp interlocking lines, felt both familiar and completely alien. He ran his fingers over them, feeling the indentations. Some had clearly been weathered by time, but others, the ones that looked fresher, felt recent, as though they had been carved within the last few years rather than centuries ago, which didn't make sense. Digging into the past, David sat back, flipping through his notes. He had started researching Redwood's lost artifacts after his first discovery of the stone hand. He had found reports dating back to the 1970s, mentioning scattered ruins, odd pieces of carved stone, fragments of what seemed to be a statue, but every time they had been reported, they had disappeared before any official examination could take place. The pattern was always the same. Someone would discover a piece of what seemed to be an ancient structure, and by the time authorities returned it was gone, either moved or buried. David had assumed time and nature had simply reclaimed the artifacts. But now, he wasn't so sure. Someone had carved that message, someone had been here, and whoever they were, they didn't want this to stay hidden forever. A new clue. David set his camera aside and stood up, brushing the dirt from his jeans. He began circling the clearing, pushing deeper into the underbrush, looking for anything else. A fragment of stone, an unnatural disturbance in the forest floor, something that could give him more context. His boots crunched over fallen leaves and twigs as he ventured farther from the clearing. And then, he saw it. A few yards away, partially obscured by a tangle of roots, was another piece of stone, smaller, but clearly connected to the hand. His pulse quickened as he crouched down, brushing away the layers of moss that had begun reclaiming it. It was a forearm, or rather, what was left of one. Cracked, worn, and missing large portions, but undeniably part of a larger figure. And just like the hand, it was marked with the same swirling symbols. David traced them with his fingertips. Some of the engravings looked ancient, while others looked sharper, more defined, as though someone had been restoring them. Why? Who would go through the effort of preserving something like this while still keeping it hidden? A faded inscription. David snapped more photos, then pulled out his notebook, jotting down every observation. As he tilted the stone slightly, something caught the light, a barely visible series of letters carved near the base. They were faint, nearly worn away by time. David narrowed his eyes, running his fingers over the indentations. It wasn't in English. It wasn't in any language he recognized immediately, but he could still read the first three letters clearly. Call? His stomach tightened. Calloway. Joe Calloway. The historian who had gone missing years ago. The one who had tried to warn others about the buried past of Redwood, and had vanished before he could reveal what he had found. David's pulse hammered. Had Calloway found this before him? Had he carved this himself? And if he had, where was he now? An unseen presence, a snap of a twig. David froze. The hair on the back of his neck stood up as he turned slowly, scanning the trees. The forest was silent. Too silent. His breath came faster now. His heart beat loud in his ears. He wasn't alone. Someone was watching him. David straightened, his grip tightening on his camera. Hello? His voice was steady, but his muscles tensed. No answer. What muscle? No answer. Only the sound of wind rustling through the redwoods. Then, another snap, closer this time. David turned in time to see a dark shape moving between the trees. And then, it was gone. Just like that. His breath came in short bursts. Whoever was out there didn't want to be seen. David swallowed hard, backing away from the stone fragment. It was clear now. This wasn't just a random piece of forgotten history. Someone had been trying to hide it. And now, someone was making sure he didn't dig too deep. The next step, David hurried back to the clearing, every instinct telling him to leave while he still could. But as he reached the stone hand, He hesitated. A new thought gripped him. If someone was trying to keep this buried, then that meant whatever was hidden here was important. He glanced back at the forest, scanning the shadows. Then, gripping his camera tightly, he made a silent vow. He wasn't done. Not yet. He would find the missing pieces. He would uncover what Calloway had tried to warn them about. And most of all, he would find out who was trying to stop him. Unveiling the past, the morning mist still clung to the towering redwoods as David pulled his jacket tighter around himself. His mind a storm of unanswered questions. The stone hand, the forearm, the name Calloway, and the shadowy figure watching him. He needed help, and he knew exactly where to start. Ranger Robles, the gatekeeper David arrived at the Redwood National Park Visitors Center just after noon. The small wooden building sat nestled between the trees, its rustic charm belying the secrets the forest held. Inside, Ranger Denise Robles leaned against the counter, flipping through a weathered field notebook. She looked up as he entered, her sharp, no-nonsense gaze locking onto him immediately. "David?" She closed the book and folded her arms. "Back so soon?" David hesitated, then pulled his phone from his pocket, flipping through the photos of the stone hand and forearm before setting it on the counter. "I need your help," he said, his voice low. Ranger Robles stared at the screen, her lips pressed into a thin line. "That's what I thought you were looking for," she muttered. David's heart kicked up a beat. "You knew about this?" Robles exhaled, rubbing a hand over her face. "Not exactly, but I've seen reports before. Old ones, long before my time." She tapped the phone. "Every so often, a hiker or a researcher stumbles across something like this. And then, she snapped her fingers. Gone. David's blood ran cold. David's blood ran cold. You mean, someone removes them? Robles nodded grimly. Most of the time, the reports go missing too. David sat back, stunned. Someone had been actively covering up the existence of these artifacts. But why, and who? Harold Pike. The old-timer's secrets. An hour later, David sat on the porch of Harold Pike's cabin, a battered old structure deep in the woods. Pike, a retired ranger in his 70s, had the weathered face of a man who had seen too much. His faded flannel shirt was patched at the elbows, his fingers rough from years of work. He listened silently as David laid out his findings. Then, with a deep sigh, he muttered, "Damn fool was right." David blinked. "Who?" Pike's gray eyes met his. "Calloway." David's breath caught. "You knew him." Pike nodded, leaning back in his rocking chair. "Back in the late 90s, Joe Calloway was poking around this forest, just like you. Said he found proof of some ancient guardian buried beneath the redwoods." David gripped the arms of his chair, and then he disappeared. Pike's jaw tightened. "He didn't just disappear," he said quietly. "He was taken." The word sent a chill down David's spine. Taken by who? Pike's gaze drifted toward the trees. "That's the part I never figured out." Leonard? The man who knows too much. David found Leonard exactly where Ranger Robles said he would be. Camped beneath a fallen redwood, his makeshift tent barely holding against the wind. The homeless man eyed David warily as he approached, his hollow cheeks and tangled beard evidence of a hard life. "I brought food," David said, setting a bag of sandwiches down. Leonard hesitated. Then, slowly, he took one and bit into it. David waited until he had eaten half before speaking again. "I need information." Leonard's eyes flickered with something. Fear? Recognition? "I found part of a statue." David continued. Leonard froze mid-bite. Then slowly he wiped his mouth and looked David dead in the eye. "You need to stop." David's stomach twisted. "Why?" Leonard exhaled, his fingers tightening around the sandwich. "Because they're still watching." David's pulse spiked. "Who?" Leonard shook his head, glancing toward the tree line. "You don't want to know." David followed his gaze. The forest seemed normal, but his instincts screamed otherwise. "Then tell me what you know," he pressed. Leonard hesitated. Then, in a low whisper, he said, "There's more." David leaned forward. "More of the statue?" Leonard nodded. "And if you find it," his voice dropped even lower, "you'll find what happened to Calloway." David's breath hitched. The missing man, the lost pieces of the Guardian, the people trying to keep them hidden. It was all connected. And for the first time, David wasn't sure he wanted the answers, but it was too late to turn back now. He had to see it through. Piecing together the guardian, the air in Redwood National Park was thick with the scent of damp earth and ancient trees, as David stood over the newly unearthed stone fragment. His fingers brushed away centuries of moss and dirt, revealing intricate runes carved into the surface. It was another piece of the statue, a massive section of the upper arm, nearly 6 feet long. He took a slow, shaky breath. This wasn't just some lost sculpture. This was something bigger, and he was running out of time to uncover the truth. A dangerous discovery. David worked quickly, snapping photos and sketching the swirling engravings covering the stone. The patterns looked almost alive, the grooves catching the faint afternoon light. Freya, his ever-loyal German shepherd, stood nearby, her ears twitching as if she sensed something watching them. And maybe she was right, because David could feel it too, the unmistakable sensation of being observed. He turned sharply, scanning the dense foliage. Nothing, just the whisper of the wind through the towering trees. But the uneasy feeling remained. Something about this place wasn't right. And as he traced the carvings on the stone, a terrifying thought gripped him. What if the statue hadn't just been buried by time? What if someone had buried it on purpose? An ominous warning. By the time David had managed to document the upper arm, the sun had begun to set, casting golden streaks across the forest floor. He needed help moving this monolithic piece. But after his conversation with Leonard, he wasn't sure who he could trust. Still, he had no choice. Back at his rental cabin, he sent the photos to Ranger Robles along with a short message. Found another piece. It's bigger. Need your thoughts. Minutes later, his phone buzzed with a reply. We need to talk. Meet me at the ranger station. Now. David swallowed hard. Something in her tone set his nerves on edge. The truth about Calloway. By the time David arrived at the ranger station, the sky had darkened, the crisp evening air thick with the scent of pine. Ranger Denise Robles was already waiting for him, arms crossed, face unreadable. Without a word, she gestured for him to follow. She led him past the main office, through a side door, and into a small records room lined with old metal filing cabinets. She pulled out a thick, dust-covered folder. This is everything we have on Calloway, she said quietly. David hesitated before opening it. The first page was a missing persons report. Joe Calloway, vanished without a trace over 20 years ago. David's throat went dry as he flipped through sketches, field notes, and frantic journal entries. Then he stopped. A single photograph caught his eye. It was a grainy black and white image of a massive stone torso, partially unearthed, covered in the same runic inscriptions. It was the missing piece of the guardian, and Calloway had found it before he disappeared. David clenched his jaw. Where was this taken? Robles hesitated. We don't know. The note stopped abruptly. David's pulse pounded. Calloway had been onto something huge, and someone had silenced him. A new lead, but at what cost? As David left the ranger station, his mind reeled. If the guardian's torso was still out there, it could be the key to unlocking everything. But if he found it, would he disappear too? David exhaled, running a hand through his hair. He needed help. There was only one person reckless enough to assist him. Leonard. And if the look on the homeless man's face was any indication, he was just as afraid as David was, because they weren't the only ones searching for the truth, and someone would do anything to keep it buried. The legend awakens. David had never sought attention. Yet, here he was, standing in front of a group of journalists, historians, and tribal elders, all waiting for him to explain something he barely understood himself. The air outside the Crescent City Community Hall was cool, laced with the salty breeze from the nearby Pacific. Freya sat beside him, ears perked, watching the crowd with quiet vigilance. He glanced at Ranger Robles, who gave him a small, reassuring nod. Then at Leonard, who hovered near the back, arms crossed, looking ready to bolt at the first sign of trouble. David took a steadying breath. And then he began to tell the story. The Guardian's story goes public. It started with a local blogger, a wildlife enthusiast who had stumbled upon the clearing where David had been working. Within a week, the story had spread like wildfire. Man uncovers ancient statue in Redwood. The Redwood Guardian, lost artifact or forgotten legend. What had begun as a quiet personal quest had turned into a mystery that captivated the town. And now David found himself caught in the storm of attention. At the meeting, a woman from the local historical society raised her hand. Mr. Wade, have you considered the possibility that this statue is connected to the pre-Columbian civilizations that lived here? David hesitated, I don't know yet, but the carvings don't match any known Native American patterns. They look almost older, said a voice from the back. The room turned toward the speaker. It was Elder Mary Ann James, one of the most respected figures in the Yurok tribe. She stepped forward slowly, her eyes sharp, filled with knowledge David hadn't yet earned the right to understand. There's a story, she said, her voice steady, deliberate. One we do not speak of often, not because we have forgotten but because it is not meant to be disturbed. A hushed silence filled the hall. Elder Mary Ann continued. A long time ago, before our people, before the trees were as tall as they are now, there was something else here, something watching over the land. Some say it was a protector. Others say it was a warning. David's throat went dry. Leonard shifted uneasily. Do you believe this is it? David finally asked. The elder regarded him with an unreadable expression. I believe you have woken something, and now you must decide what to do with it. Unwanted attention. As David left the meeting, his thoughts swirled with possibilities. A protector? A warning? What if both were true? But his growing unease wasn't just from the legend. It was from the fact that not everyone in town wanted him to continue. That night, as he returned to his rental cabin, he noticed something was wrong. The door was ajar. Inside, papers were scattered, drawers left open, the photos of the statue's fragments gone. Freya let out a low warning growl as David scanned the room. Then he saw it. A single word scratched into the wooden table with a knife. Stop. David's blood ran cold. Someone else knew about the Guardian, and they didn't want it unearthed. A desperate decision. He had two choices. Leave it alone. Forget the Guardian. Let it sink back into obscurity. See this through, no matter what it cost. David clenched his fists. He wasn't done yet, because whoever was trying to stop him, they were scared. And that meant he was closer to the truth than ever before. The Guardian rises again. The morning air in Redwood National Park was thick with the scent of damp earth and pine needles. Sunlight filtered through the towering trees, casting golden beams onto the forest floor. It had been weeks since David first unearthed the stone hand, and now, with the help of the Yurok tribe, park rangers, and volunteers, the Guardian was slowly being rebuilt. But not without resistance. David could still feel the weight of that single word "stop" carved into his cabin table. He knew someone didn't want the Guardian restored, and that meant they had to work quickly. Sacred knowledge and forgotten warnings. Elder Mary Ann James walked beside David as they made their way to the clearing where the scattered fragments of the statue lay. The other Yurok elders had given their cautious blessing to the restoration, but with it came a warning. You must listen to the land, she had told him. If the Guardian was buried, it was buried for a reason. David still didn't know if that reason was protection or containment. As they reached the site, Ranger Robles, Leonard, and several volunteers were already at work. Ropes, pulleys, and wooden supports had been set up to help lift the larger stone pieces into place. How much longer do you think this will take? Robles asked, hands on her hips, scanning the half-assembled figure. David wiped sweat from his forehead. If we don't run into any surprises, maybe a week, Leonard scoffed. You say that like we won't run into surprises. This thing's been buried for who knows how long. Something put it there. David didn't argue. The way the forest felt different lately, as if the trees themselves were watching, told him that this wasn't just archaeology. This was something older, something that didn't want to be forgotten. The hidden piece, the restoration, was painstaking work. Every piece of stone had to be carefully examined, cleaned, and lifted into place. The runes covering the Guardian's arms and torso had been partially reconstructed, revealing patterns of swirling lines that seemed to pulse in certain lighting. Then, two volunteers made a discovery that changed everything. David, you need to see this. David jogged over to where they stood near the base of an ancient redwood, the bark thick and scarred with time. At the tree's base, half buried in the soft soil, was a massive stone face, the missing head of the Guardian. Unlike the other fragments, this one was different. The eyes were closed, the mouth slightly parted, as if the Guardian had been caught mid-breath. The runes across the forehead seemed more pronounced, sharper than the others, and when David pressed his hand against it, he felt warmth. Not the warmth of the sun-heated stone, but something alive, something waiting. The first sign that night, as David sat by his cabin window, Freya curled up beside him. The forest seemed too quiet. No wind, no rustling leaves, just the weight of silence. Then, a low vibration, so soft it could have been his imagination, rippled through the floor. Freya's head shot up, ears pricked, David barely had time to react before a deep, echoing sound, like a faraway drum, rolled through the forest. And just like that, the silence returned. Freya whined, pressing closer to him. David swallowed hard. The Guardian was waking up. The rising of the Redwood Guardian, the final piece, had been lifted into place. David stood beneath the towering stone figure, its rune-carved body now whole again. The Guardian, once scattered across the depths of Redwood National Park, now stood as it had centuries before, a silent sentinel watching over the land. The team, Ranger Robles, Leonard, Elder Marianne, and the many volunteers who had come and gone over the weeks, stood in awed silence. For the first time since he had arrived at Redwood, David felt something shift within him. This wasn't just a restoration, it was a resurrection. A heartbeat in stone as the last rope was untied. A hush fell over the clearing. The Guardian, now standing tall, seemed more than just a statue. It felt alive. David reached out, pressing his palm against the cold stone surface, and then he felt it, a faint pulse beneath his fingertips. Not stone, not dead, something more. The runes along the Guardian's arms and torso, now fully connected, glowed faintly, as if responding to his touch. The forest around them stirred, a soft gust of wind weaving through the redwoods, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and pine. Elder Marianne stepped forward, her weathered hands running gently over the ancient carvings. Her eyes shone with something between reverence and understanding. It remembers. Her whisper sent a shiver down David's spine. David's journey comes full circle. David stepped back, staring at the towering form of the Guardian. His chest felt tight, not with fear, but with realization. He had come here to escape, to bury his grief, but this journey had done something he never expected. It had rebuilt him. Just as the Guardian had been shattered and lost to time, David had arrived in Redwood a broken man. But through each stone he unearthed, each puzzle he solved, each bond he formed, something within him had mended. Freya, who had been with him since the start, pressed her nose against his palm. Her puppies, now strong and playful, wrestled near the forest's edge. David smiled. For the first time in a long, long time, he felt whole. A new purpose as the weeks passed. The Guardian became a beacon, not just for those who had helped rebuild it, but for the entire community. Locals came to see it. Historians, tribal elders, artists, and even children, all standing in its shadow, feeling the same quiet sense of wonder David had felt the day he found that first stone hand buried in the moss. David decided to stay, not because he had to, but because for the first time he had a reason to. The last whisper of the forest one evening, as the sun dipped below the towering redwoods, David sat on his cabin's porch, Freya resting at his feet. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves. Then, just for a moment, David swore he heard something in the wind. A whisper, not words, but a feeling. Gratitude. The Guardian stood again, and so did he. The connection between humans and nature, lessons from the Redwood Guardian in today's fast-paced world, where the invisible pressures of life pull us in different directions. There are moments when we feel lost, disconnected, or burdened by unhealed wounds. It is in these moments that nature becomes a sanctuary, a silent teacher that can guide us toward healing, not just physically, but also emotionally and spiritually. David's story is not just about uncovering an ancient statue. It is a journey of self-discovery. Much like the Guardian buried deep in the forest, each of us carries fragments of our past, memories of loss, pain, or struggles that we sometimes try to bury. But instead of hiding them forever, David learned that reassembling the broken pieces, facing the past, and working with others to create something meaningful was the key to finding peace and hope once again. His act of rescuing Freya and her puppies serves as a powerful reminder that compassion and connection with the world around us can lead to profound transformations. In life, even the smallest acts of kindness, a thoughtful gesture, a word of encouragement, or a moment of genuine care, can help heal someone else's wounds, and in turn, become a way of healing ourselves. Additionally, his journey to uncover the Guardian reminds us that the world is full of hidden wonders, waiting to be discovered by those who are patient and open enough to see them. There are times when life feels meaningless or overwhelming, but if we dare to step beyond our comfort zones, explore the unknown, and seek the untold stories, we might find something far more valuable than answers. a renewed sense of purpose. Furthermore, the collaboration between David and the people he met along the way, Ranger Robles, Elder Marianne, demonstrates the power of community. We don't have to face everything alone. Sometimes, it is only when we open up, share our journey, and work together for a greater purpose that we truly make a lasting impact. In reality, each person is facing their own struggles, whether it's loss, loneliness, or uncertainty about the future. But like the Guardian, if we take small steps, learning to reconnect with nature, caring for the little things around us, helping others, and believing in the magic of life, we may one day find ourselves standing strong once again, more whole than ever before. Because nature is not just a place we visit to explore, it is also where we find ourselves again. Thank you for joining us on this journey. If this story moved you, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more inspiring stories of resilience, hope, and the unbreakable spirit of life. See you in the next story.